Okay, folks, assuming the technology is working, here we are with Unit 5, Social Psychology and Personality. This is chapters 9 and 10. So we begin with chapter 9, Social Psych. So social psychology is the study of how people influence other people's behavior, beliefs, and attitudes. It's basically saying if you want to understand people, you must understand us all in a context that involves other people, that we define ourselves and others, at least in part, in terms of the roles that we play. So, going back through, the history of our species and our ancestors as early hominids in Africa, we evolved in these little small tribes, right? Small, tight social bands. And to this day, we are predisposed to form intimate interpersonal bonds with small groups, sometimes referred to as cliques. The size of most human social groups is typically no larger than about 150 people. And this is something that is kind of evolved. So for example, the average number of friends people have on Facebook is a little over 100. 150 is close to the average number of people that we know reasonably well. So why the limitation? Why isn't it 500 or 1,000? We think part of the reason must be that the size of our cortex places limits on how many people with whom we can closely associate. It takes a lot of brain power to sustain and maintain interpersonal relationships. A lot of memory, a lot of social and emotional skills. And we just couldn't keep more than about 150, of those balls in the air. Need to belong theory says that we have a biologically based need for interpersonal connections. This is basically saying, human beings have evolved to be social animals. So Stanley Schachter, back in 1959 here, did a study, very small study, where he asked 5 male volunteers to live alone in separate rooms for an extended time period. And all 5 of them were miserable and stressed. One called it quits after 20 minutes. 3 of them lasted a couple days. One made it to 8 days, but reported that it caused him great anxiety. To add to that, we know that inmates in solitary confinement experience more psychological symptoms than those in the general prison population. Solitary confinement is considered in some places as cruel and unusual punishment. We're not supposed to be, isolated like that. Even the most introverted among us needs connections with other humans. Study was done back in 2003 by Williams and his colleagues, where they had participants play a computerized ball tossing game while they were in an fMRI scanner. Right? So in this game, they're tossing a virtual ball to other partners. They all thought they were playing catch with other real people. In fact, they weren't. They were computer-generated other people. And the game was rigged so that the other so-called participants eventually started ignoring the actual participant. And upon experiencing this social rejection, participants showed activation of the cingulate cortex, a brain region that becomes active during physical pain. So in other words, this social rejection was treated by the brain much like physical pain. It does kind of literally hurt when we are socially ostracized. We know that a fair number of people experience ongoing, that is chronic loneliness, depending on what study you read, something like 15 to 30% of people. And the chronically lonely are more likely to experience depression, as you might imagine. And the research suggests that the loneliness precedes the depression. It comes first, which tells us that it's likely a cause of the depression. It also predicts cognitive decline, heightened risk for Alzheimer's disease. So the gist of this is that being isolated and lonely is really hard for our species. We're social creatures. We're wired that way due to evolutionary forces. We influence others, we're influenced by others, and to be happy, even the most introverted among us needs contact with other people from time to time. So now let's talk a little bit about how we influence others, social influence processes. Most of the time, the influence that other people have on us is adaptive, meaning that it's useful, right? So things like obeying authority figures, learning to wait your turn, respecting your elders, all of this helps to regulate living in a society together so that we don't kill each other, right? All of this is kind of social lubricant to make sure we get along. Many social influence processes have been naturally selected because they have served us well over the course of evolution. So those among us back in the, the ancestral realm who couldn't get along with others, who couldn't share, who couldn't wait their turn, who didn't obey, didn't live very long because we needed to rely on each other for survival. So evolution selected for the ability to get along with others. And that means the willingness and openness to be affected and influenced by each other. Okay? So these processes are kind of built in, but they can also backfire. There is a dark side to this tendency to kind of obey. And that is when, the authorities are malevolent, when they are, negative and evil. So conformity, obedience, and other forms of social influence become maladaptive. That is the opposite of helpful, right? When they're blind, when it's blind obedience, unquestioning obedience. Irrational group behaviors are byproducts of adaptive processes that have gone wrong. So the very processes that make sort of the best of human nature, sharing and caring about others, the flip side of that, right, is this potential for blindly obeying malevolent, evil authority. Right? So where do we stand? One of the ways that we affect each other is in terms of our understanding of who we are, right? Part of our sense of self is developed as a function of comparison with other people. So social comparison theory is an idea created by Leon Festinger. He says we seek to evaluate our abilities and beliefs by comparing them with those of others. So one of the ways we sort of learn about ourselves is to look at what we can do and what we believe and how we behave and compare it to what other people are doing and believing and behaving. So we have some choices here when we compare ourselves to other people. We can do what's called an upward social comparison, which is when we compare ourselves with people who seem superior to us in some way, right? So whenever we're looking at like celebrities or, heroes that we have, we see them as better than us, as more successful than us, as smarter than us, and we can sort of compare ourselves in that way, right? And the risk here is that we can end up feeling bad about ourselves, right? You're looking at these celebrities with these amazing lives, and you think, wow, they're so much better than me. I'm a big loser. So that's a possibility. The plus side here is if we do an upward comparison with people who aren't that different from us, they're not way, way high up on the ladder, or they have some component that makes us feel connected to them, then that's what a role model can be, right? That's when we look to others and say, well, if they can do it, maybe I can do it, right? And so in that sense, upward social comparison can be something that motivates us. Now, the opposite is called downward social comparison, and that's when we compare ourselves to those who seem inferior in some way, right? So you compare yourself to someone who makes less money or who is less socially successful or whatever. And when we do this, one consequence is that we can feel a little bit better about ourselves. Right? You can look at someone who's made a real mess of their life and say, at least I'm not them. That's the appeal to these shows like Jerry Springer, although Springer's not on anymore, but Maury Povich and shows like that, right? They trot out these kind of train wreck lives, and you can watch it and say to yourself, well, at least I'm not sleeping with my brother's boyfriend or whatever the subject matter is. So both kinds of comparison, whether it's upward or downward, has the potential to boost our self-concept, right? Can make us feel better about ourselves. But an unfavorable comparison of our own status with that of others can also produce this feeling known as relative deprivation, which is the belief that no matter how much you're getting in terms of recognition or status or money, it's less than you deserve, right? It's like, you've been working at a job for a while and you're happy with your hourly wage. And then you find out the new guy is making more than you. You had been happy with your wage until you found that out. And now it's unfair, right? And you're very much unhappy. That's relative deprivation. And when this happens in large groups of people, this is when the potential for political unrest, social unrest may follow. This is maybe the 99% protests, things like that. So it can be a motivator for social and political change, right? Relative deprivation. All right, moving on. Social contagion. We often turn to others to figure out how we should respond in an ambiguous situation. We've talked about this already in the course a few times, but when we don't know what to do in an ambiguous situation, a situation where we're not sure, we look to other people, right? We learn through observation. And usually this is a good strategy. If you don't know which fork to use, at the fancy dinner party, you look to what the person beside you is doing for clues. Right? The problem arises when the people, that we're looking to for clues are actually behaving erratically. Then we have the potential to also behave in an irrational, erratic, and sometimes, violent way. So this is what, herd mentality or mob mentality may refer to. People will do things in groups that they would not otherwise do. An example might be mass hysteria, right? A contagious outbreak of irrational behavior that spreads. So for example, UFO sightings often come in waves. And it may happen like this, there's a slow news day and there's a call into the news, the local news, where somebody says they saw a weird thing up in the sky. And for whatever reason, they decide to make a story out of it. They go and send a reporter to this person. They do a little interview in the backyard. And then you've got thousands of people watching the news saying, oh, that's interesting. They saw something weird in the sky. So they go out in their backyards and they look up and maybe they see something weird in the sky, be it a satellite or whatever it might be. And they call the news. And before you know it, you've got this kind of rash of UFO sightings, right? So they often come in clusters. Another example of a social contagion is an urban legend. These are stories that, make the rounds and don't have any basis in truth. For example, the idea that there are alligators living in the sewers in New York City. This is an old kind of legend story that's been passed around for decades. And it's almost always in the form of, my friend's cousin's sister, saw an alligator. Oh yeah, no, it's true, they saw it, right? But it's always hard to track down who the friend's cousin's sister was. An urban legend. All right, what about social facilitation and social disruption? These are other ways in which the presence of other people can affect us. So social facilitation is where the presence of others actually improves our performance. Disruption is when it detracts from our performance. So for example, the presence of an audience. Okay, what's gonna happen if you are, say, giving a talk or performing in front of an audience is that the audience will ramp up physiological arousal. Your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up. It will also ramp up your desire to do well because of the feelings that you're going to be evaluated, right? So kind of the pressure is on. Now that kind of physiological arousal is going to bring out our most dominant behaviors, meaning the behaviors that we know best. So if the task you are doing in front of the audience is something that you know well, something that you're good at, then this increase in arousal will facilitate your behavior. You'll actually do really well, better than you would have done if you were, say, on your own, and that's social facilitation. But if the task is hard or brand new, the opposite can happen. All of that pressure can lead to social disruption, choking, for example, doing less well, a reduction in performance because of the presence of other people. So, how the other people are going to affect you depends upon how prepared you are and or how easy the task is. Here's another cool example. This is Robert Zions, and he did a study published in 1969 where he took a bunch of cockroaches and they were randomly assigned to either run a maze on their own or to run a maze with a little audience of other cockroaches in spectator boxes watching them. And what he found was that the cockroaches with the audience ran faster and made fewer mistakes in the maze. So there was a kind of social facilitation effect even for the cockroaches. Kind of interesting. Okay, let's move along and talk about attributions. An attribution is an explanation we come up with for the causes of people's behaviors, including our own. So, as we're going through life, we are coming up with reasons why people are doing the things they're doing, reasons why things are happening to others and to ourselves, right? They are stories that we invent to explain stuff, okay? And we have choices when we invent stories. One set of choices is whether we will go with an internal versus an external attribution. So an internal attribution is when we attribute behavior to something inside the person, internal, what we call a dispositional cause, something about their disposition, their personality, right? Their personhood. So for example, you have an uncle who owns a hardware store and the store goes bankrupt. An internal attribution for that might be you saying, well, Uncle Joe never really had a good head for business. He should have never tried to open a store. He just doesn't have what it takes, right? So that is an internal attribution. An external attribution is when we attribute the behavior to outside causes, characteristics of the situation, not the person. So Uncle Joe's hardware store goes under, and you say, well, Walmart moved in a few blocks down and took all the business away. So that is an explanation for the failure that says the cause was outside of Uncle Joe as opposed to inside Uncle Joe. Interestingly, we find that there are different, tendencies, different preferences by culture. External attributions are more likely to be found in collectivist cultures, less likely to be found in individualist cultures. So what do those terms mean, collectivist versus individualist? An individualist culture is one where the members are concerned more with the well-being of themselves, right? The primary focus for individuals is themselves and their immediate families. We are living in an individualist culture. The US is kind of the poster child of individualism. Whereas a collectivist culture is more where the members of the society all see themselves more as group members and that their primary goals should have to do with the well-being of the group as opposed to the well-being of one's own little self, right? So in collectivist cultures, you're more likely to make external attributions. Individualist cultures, we're more likely to see successes and failures as being because of the person, the individual. So there's something called the fundamental attribution error, which is a bias that we have towards over-attributing the behavior of others to internal causes. Right? And this is something that we have in individualist societies. So someone cuts you off in traffic, and you are likely to see that behavior as evidence of bad character, right? So a behavior you don't like is taken as evidence that that person is somehow flawed, right? What a jerk, what an idiot. Okay? So the fundamental attribution error is that when we look at other people's behaviors, we overestimate the importance of their disposition, right? We're seeing their behaviors as a sign of their personality. And we underestimate the impact of the situation, right? The context that they're in. And yet, when we are coming up with attributions for our own behavior, we do the opposite, right? If I myself catch myself doing something that is bad, yelling at a waiter or something, I have reasons why I'm doing that are external, right? As opposed to saying I'm a bad person. I have an explanation along the lines of the waiter was rude or their behavior was inexcusable, as opposed to, gee, I'm a jerk. Okay, so when we witness someone behaving badly, we see it as evidence of bad character. But when we're the ones behaving badly, we see it as having to do with the situation, as opposed to saying, wow, I'm a bad person. Okay, and that's the fundamental attribution error. Why do we do it? Well, there's a couple of things to consider. First of all, we have differing awareness of situational factors as a function of whether we are the person acting or the person watching someone else act, right? When we're the ones engaging in the behavior, let's say I cut someone off in traffic, I am more aware of the situational factors behind that, right? Like there was a lot of confusion on the street or something like that. I'm less aware of that if somebody else cuts me off. I don't have access to what was going on in their immediate environment. And so I'm going to attribute it to them being a lousy person. To use another example, let's say you're a teacher and you've got a kid who acts up in class. Little Billy is acting up. You as the teacher see his bad behavior. And it may be that you're tempted to think that kid is such a jerk, right? You're not seeing the situational causes that perhaps little Billy is aware of. Things like maybe his parents are going through a divorce, maybe they're moving, maybe he's being picked on, you don't know. Okay? The exception to this, to the fundamental attribution error, is if you've been in a similar situation to the person you're observing, right? Or you've been encouraged to feel empathetic towards them. So if you're the teacher and you've got this kid who's acting like a little monster in your classroom, but you yourself went through some tough stuff when you were a kid, you may be more inclined to think, oh, I've been there. I bet this kid is going through some stuff at home. Or if you're being encouraged to be empathetic, if somebody else says to you, yeah, Billy's parents are divorcing, his home life is kind of rough right now, then maybe you're going to be less inclined to see his behavior as a sign that he's a bad person. Okay, and that's really, again, part of empathy. All right, so what about the effects of culture here? People from collectivist cultures, places like Japan and China, the Middle East, where they tend to identify themselves as a part of a group more than as an individual, they're less likely to commit the fundamental attribution error. They tend to be more aware of situational influences, placing less emphasis on individual factors. Okay. In general, social psychologists argue that situational factors are more important than dispositional factors. The biggest reason why you are acting the way you are is the situation you're in, right? So social psychologists say we really tend to underestimate the importance of context. A big reason why you're behaving the way you're behaving right now is the situation you're in. Presumably you're sitting there watching this video, maybe taking notes, I don't know, but let's assume you are. You're sitting there taking notes, not because you love sitting still and taking notes, but because you're in the role of a student right now, right? So very typically, the best reason why someone's behaving the way they are is the situation. And that is sort of the fundamental tenet of social psychology. The law of crappy systems trumps the law of crappy people. People behave badly often because the system is set up to facilitate that kind of behavior. Okay, how about conformity? This is one of sort of the pet topics of social psychology. So conformity is changing one's behavior or beliefs to match those of others, generally as a result of real or imagined group pressure, right? So when we conform, we are changing either our thoughts or our behaviors or both to match what we see in other people. Usually because we have this sense, this pressure that we should. So the first big study looking at conformity was Solomon Asch's experiments in the 1950s. So in Asch's research, if you were a participant in his study, you would be, a student at the university, you'd sign up to participate, you'd show up at the lab at the appointed time, and there'd be this table in the room, right? And all these other students sitting around it. One spot left for you, so you sit your little self down, and these 6 others are pretending to be other students. They're actually what we call confederates, meaning that they're in on the study, but you don't know that. Okay? So you sit down, and the researcher tells everybody that the task is going to be judging the lengths of lines. It's a perceptual study. So basically, they show you a target line, like this one here, and then 3 other lines, A, B, and C, and the job is to identify which of these 3 lines is the same as the target line, right? Is it A, is it B, is it C? And so the researcher starts to go around the table asking all the people, which one do you think, which one do you think, which one do you think, right? And the interesting thing is each person gives the wrong answer. Right? So in this example, the right answer would be C, right? But the first person says A, second person says A, third person says A, fourth, fifth, sixth, all say A. Then comes you. You're the only real subject, but you don't know that. And the study really is about, what are you going to do? Are you going to go along with what everyone else said? Or are you going to deviate from the consensus and say what you know to be true? Will you conform or not? So what does the genuine participant do, right? What he found was that about 70% of participants conformed to the group norm, the incorrect group norm, at least once over 12 trials. Right? So there's this fairly common reaction where the person will just go along with what everybody else said, even though they know it's not true. So he started to play with this to figure out the conditions under which conformity are more or less likely to happen. And here's what he found out. First of all, the ambiguity of the situation is important. As the task gets less and less obvious, right, as you make those, those 3 lines closer to the target, it gets more and more kind of ambiguous, and people become more and more reliant on what the other people say. So that makes sense, right? As the task gets harder, people are more likely to just go along with what everybody else says. Think about what that means for like jury deliberations and stuff, right? He also found that unanimity is powerful, meaning that there's the greatest pressure to conform when all of the other people are saying the same thing. So if everybody else around the table is saying it's line A, then the real participant is under particular pressure to conform. Right? If one other person says, no, I don't think it's line A, I think it's C, then the real participant is very likely to say that too. The size of the majority is important too. So Ash started to play with how many people do you need around the table to get this effect? And rather surprisingly, he found that conformity reaches its kind of maximum effect at around 3 or 4 members. You just need 3 or 4 other people around the table, all agreeing on the same wrong answer to get this effect. Further additions really didn't add a whole lot. So maximum conformity is reached with around 4 people, which is rather surprising, I think. Some differences in conformity. People with low self-esteem are more likely to conform. So sometimes it takes confidence to stand out, right? It takes a certain grit to be able to say, I disagree with everyone else in the room, right? People from collectivist cultures, like many Asian cultures, are more likely to conform than people from individualist places like North America. Remember that in collectivist cultures, everyone's identity is kind of more wrapped up in being members of a group. And so they will value keeping the group happy over being right personally. Okay? No gender differences. Early studies suggested that women are more likely to conform, but that was not found in repeated studies. So, it doesn't look like there are gender differences with conformity. All right. This is probably a good place to halt this video and move to the second portion of Unit 5. So I'm going to do that right now, if I can figure it out here. Okay, see you soon.